just like Sanho you've been talking about.
So I'm curious, as a judge, when did you first start questioning the war on drugs? How did you come to this position? Was there a particular tipping point or case?
There actually was. I was on the bench, it would have been around 1984, 85. And I was implementing another judge's sentence. I was overseeing the lower level courts, and he'd worked out some form of a sentence agreement. And so I was telling the defendant, who was a young man, a bad guy actually, he was being tried as an adult, where he was going with prostitutes, would rape them, would rob them, beat them up, and he did that on like 8 or 9 occasions. And so this is a bad guy. His sentence allowed him to be released from confinement after about 2 weeks, given his pre-sentence credits. And so once we went through all of this, and I gave him he gave me a factual basis, and I gave him his constitutional rights, and we went through all of this, he let out a war whoop when he was being led back into custody because he thought he'd won. And you know something? He had. And the thought just was planted in my mind, Sanho. We're spending all this money on low-level drug offenses. We don't have the money to go after the legitimate thugs, the people that are really involved with robbery, rape, and murder. And that kind of planted the seed in me. And then several years later, I came out with my press conference. And I found, in fact, doing my research for my first book on drug policy, of Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed, I found that in 1980, we were only half as successful in our country, nationwide, in prosecuting homicides as we had been. In 1990, we're only half as effective as we had been in 1980. Why? Because the Reagan administration yet again ratcheted up the war on drugs, and we're spending all of these resources to go after these drug dealers or drug problems. We don't have the money to prosecute homicides. So I determined, and it's true, the tougher you get with regard to drug crimes, literally the softer you get with regard to the prosecution of everything else. We only have so many resources. Let's spend them in an effort to prosecute the people that are causing harm in our society. There's one just short leap from there that is a truth. Is a truism that we should recognize in our great country, and that is, let's hold people accountable for their actions, not what they put into their bodies. And in that regard, we all know who Robert Downey Jr. is, a very talented actor, and he will always be a heroin-addicted person. He will always have those propensities. He has this medical problem. It makes as much sense to me to put Robert Downey Jr. in jail for his heroin problem as it would have Betty Ford in jail for her alcohol problem. It's the same thing. It's a medical problem. Bring them closer to medical professionals that can help them. That is not a police problem. But if Robert Downey Jr., Betty Ford, you or I drive a motor vehicle impaired by, you fill in the blank, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, whatever, methamphetamines, bring them to me as a judge. That's a crime and should be. Why? What's the difference? Now, because of their actions, they're putting our safety at risk. That is a legitimate criminal justice function. But with regard to trying to control what they put into their bodies, number one, we can't do it. And number two, we shouldn't. I'm a libertarian. I think as an adult, the government has as much right to control what I put into my body as it does what I put into my mind. It's none of their business. So the answer, you haven't asked me, but I'll tell you anyway. The answer in this issue is to follow what we finally did when we repealed alcohol prohibition. We took the federal government out of it. But the federal government did not say, you in New Jersey, you in Arkansas, you wherever, will now make alcohol available. They didn't say that at all. They simply said, each state now can decide how best to serve and protect its people. And the federal government's role here will simply be reduced to assisting each state in enforcing its chosen laws. And so, if we do the same thing here, maybe some states will do the same. Fine, that's great. We're going to see the same problem, and I hope we talk about it with regard to California in the upcoming election to treat marijuana like alcohol. They're really smart in that proposition. They'll leave it to each city to decide how to do this. That's wonderful. So, in this example, maybe Illinois will come up with something that works pretty well. Terrific. Indiana next door will come up with something that they think is a good idea, and one way or the other it won't pan out. What happens then in Illinois? Basically, it's working. We might fine-tune it a little bit, but let's leave it alone. Indiana will look around saying, Charlie, come on, it's a pretty good idea at the time, but this isn't working. What should we do? Wait a minute, let's look at Illinois. What they're doing is working pretty well. Let's try that. and with these 50 crucibles of democracy, in effect, we'll work out things that work. And maybe in Oklahoma it'll work differently than in New York. Terrific. Let them do it. That's really an important thing that the Founding Fathers, by the way, would ratify. How do I know that? Look at the Constitution. Look at the 9th and 10th Amendments. That's exactly what the Constitution says. So I think we can all agree, we can all hold hands and say, the federal government does not have all the answers. Let's let each state decide, and then we'll come up with things that work.
Now, you've been looking at this issue for a long time. I've been working on this for a dozen years. Just in the course of my lifetime, we've squandered as a nation more than $1 trillion on the failed war on drugs. People take it for granted that it's always been with us, and they think it'll always be with us. And it's very difficult to pull yourself out of the moment and look at things in perspective. In a previous career, I was a historian. And if you asked me about, if I were writing a book 100 years ago about the end of empires, people would have said, you're insane. Empires are the way of the world. They will always be with us, and within a generation they were gone. If I were writing a book about women's suffrage a century ago, they said, no, that's never going to happen. And yet within a generation it happened. The civil rights movement in the 40s and 50s, people would say, we're never going to get civil rights in this country. And yet within a decade it happened. The fall of the Berlin Wall. We can go on and on and on. As a historian, the only certainty is change itself, and very often sometimes it's even for the better. So in the case of the war on drugs, we are about to approach a tipping point in California through Prop 19. Can you give us a little background on Prop 19 and what you think about its likelihood of passage and what that means politically?
So no, I think that the Proposition 19, which basically would treat marijuana like alcohol for adults, is a pivotal election. And by the way, while you were talking here, I'm going through my mind and thinking of different anecdotes. I was sitting in the offices of 2 individual members of Congress from Orange County several years ago now. Individually, they brought up the issue with regard to my discussions on drug policy, and they said, Jim, pretty much everyone in Washington understands that our drug policy, our war on drugs, is not winnable, but it's eminently fundable. And people in Washington are addicted to the funding. So if you look at any agency we have in the federal government, you look at their funding, their budget, each one has millions, tens of millions of extra dollars in there to promote the war on drugs. They don't want to give up that funding. So the answer pretty much as to why this continues is money. What about Proposition 19, treat marijuana like alcohol for adults? Everyone in this room, by the way, knows someone that can vote in California. People watching on C-SPAN, they know people that vote in California. Take it personally, talk to those people, take it upon yourselves to tell them to give serious thought to supporting Proposition 19 in California this coming November. What would it do? You know something? If this were to pass, and adults could treat marijuana like alcohol, what would happen? First, recognizing any of us over 21 could go home tonight and drink 10 martinis. Not a smart thing to do, certainly not medically a healthy thing to do, but not a violation of law, once again, unless you drive a motor vehicle or beat up your spouse or otherwise. So hold people accountable for their actions. And they could do the same thing with marijuana if they wanted to. But let's look at it. Go down this road for a moment. If this were to pass, if we were to treat marijuana like alcohol in the state of California, 6 things would happen. 5 of them demonstrably beneficial, then we'll talk about the 6th.